We are back and we are joined again by Hayden Clarkin, also known as the Transit Guy, all over social media. And that's the name of your Substack. So when
Yeah,
did you launch that Substack? Congrats.
thanks. So obviously Twitter became a hell site, and so I
Yeah.
decided, what is the point of like putting in like this time to actually try and educate people on like transit when all it is just bots and like MAGA people or
Hmm.
Elon bros. And so I decided maybe I should do something more long form. And I've been really enjoying it actually. It's actually a really fun. I know it sounds very coastal elitist, but it's actually like a really fun place to actually like get into policy rather than like we should have these things and people are like, yeah, we should, but how do we do them, right? Like,
Right.
so it just kind of is able to like arm some of that a little bit better.
So if anybody is interested in transit policy, you should definitely check out that Substack. Hayden is a great place to start. And
Appreciate it.
last time we spoke, I do think we talked about congestion pricing. I can't
That's why you
remember
had me on.
anything.
Yeah.
Yeah. It has been implemented
Yes.
finally.
Mhm.
Can you explain how it works, what it is, and I guess
Yeah.
also some of the changes that were made in between like the original intent of the bill and then
Yeah.
how Hochul tweaked it to because there was outrage from suburbia, specifically
Yeah.
New
Yeah.
Jersey. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure, I don't know if you've covered it already, but you might have seen Obama getting a little bit of like a tap from George W. Bush at Carter's funeral. And I would like to tell everyone and all the Republicans in Nassau County who are really mad about congestion pricing that congestion pricing was actually something that was introduced under the Bush administration in 2007. So this was actually a market solution to congestion. Yeah, basically, since the 50s, 60s, and 70s, especially under Ed Koch, the idea that like congestion was out of control in lower Manhattan was always something that's been a problem, especially when during the entire decade of the 70s, when New York City was found to be not in compliance with the Clean Air Act because the smog and congestion was really terrible. And so Ed Koch was like, great, we're going to ban cars from almost all of the bridge crossings. This was in 1979, and the Supreme Court said you can't do that on your own. And so we've had congestion forever. And then in 2007, under Bloomberg and in partnership with Bush's DOT at the time, under Ray LaHood, they decided, what if we actually start implementing a congestion pricing between the hours of 5 a.m. and 9 p.m. every day in order to kind of discourage people from driving down the densest part of North America, as well as the most transit rich portion. And it just kind of went from Bloomberg to de Blasio, and then Andrew Cuomo was like, yeah, this is a great idea. I don't know if I'm how long you've been in New York City for, if you've been in your whole life, but if you remember in 2017, the New York City subway was like in a crisis, like in a crisis. Like we had a state of emergency under Cuomo of like getting the subways fixed. And in order to get all of like the hundreds of miles and 472 stations of deferred maintenance of the New York City subway after 5 decades of neglect, they decided, well, what if we actually charge people with this congestion pricing to get into Manhattan, and we'll use the money generated against borrowing a ridiculous sum of money. At the time, it's about $15 billion, so that we can fund our capital plan. And so that was the goal. And in 2019, the state budget was Cuomo actually slipped that into the budget. And so it was approved, and people didn't really hear a lot about it because I will give Cuomo credit. He kind of just like masterfully like snuck it in. And so it went through, and we were going to implement it in 2021, but the optics of that is really bad when New York City during 2021 was like empty under lockdown. It
Right.
didn't make sense. In
Right.
fact, we probably should have charged people like to come to the city just to like, liven up liven up the city a little bit.
Yeah.
And so they were like bad optics. And then it was compelled to actually happen in 2024 based on the law that within 5 years it needed to happen. And you have to make $1 billion. So it was going to be $15 to get into the city. And then you would get a rebate based on what tunnel you came into. So for like the Midtown Tunnel, I think it was like $6 at the time at the original proposal. So you'd be paying like $9 extra, and it's a one-time fee. Doesn't matter how many times you go in and out of Lower Manhattan all day. It's this one-time fee. And so right about 2 weeks before it was supposed to happen in June of last year, Kathy Hochul was like, we're not doing it anymore. Forget it. We're pausing it. It's
After
a bad
lobbying,
idea.
really, it's from wealthy suburbanites who want the option to go and drive into the city is basically the group of people that were most pissed off about this. Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, there has been a lot of like hubbub on social media, especially on TikTok, of like, it's a tax on the working poor. 90% of the people who work lower than 60th Street take transit, 90%. So they were talking about 10%. And of that, I think it's mid six digits. I think it's like $150,000 to $180,000 is the average salary or income of someone who drives into the city. So we're not talking
because
about
the tolls are already crazy.
Yes.
You're already paying a toll to get in, which were raised, I mean, multiple times. And so this is just an added expense to people who could already afford to pay the tolls instead of taking transit.
That's correct. And you also get a rebate based on it. The only place you don't get a rebate is if you're coming in from Upper West Side or Upper East Side, because you're not getting tolled until you get to that point. So yeah, that was the plan. It was going to be $15 and was going to happen. And then she said no. And I think one thing that like killed her, obviously she has no political prowess, but like one of the things that killed her like logic was that she had said that like diners in New York City were going to go extinct because I guess people from New Jersey, the state known for 500 diners, people drive into the city to go to diners across the street from Grand Central.
No, they don't. Okay, I'm sorry. This is just as like little New Yorker stuff. I was born in New York and then grew up in suburbs New Jersey, then moved here, right? I remember diners from when I was a kid in New York City. They're not here anymore because they've all been priced out by like really luxury housing or restaurants that have financial backing, rent. Like diners are more low cost options. They're all in New Jersey now. There used to be great New York City diners, but they don't exist anymore because they were, they can't afford it. Anyway, keep going.
Yeah, no, she just used like really bad examples. There's a cafe, I can't remember the name of it. It's literally right under the road bridge that like leads you into Grand Central. And she was like, oh, that diner, I talked to the owner there like 2 days before I canceled it. And he said it was a bad idea. And like, I'm like, I'm sorry, but Grand Central is literally the biggest train station on the planet. If he needs cars to like go to his thing, then we're really screwed. So anyway, it didn't happen. I came on here and I pontificated. You and I both kind of went back and forth of like, was this a call from Hakeem Jeffries? Was this a Chuck Schumer call? Was this a President Biden call? Who did it? Or and I think looking back on it, it was a Hakeem Jeffries call because Kathy Hochul is still. I mean, she let it happen. So she decided after the election that it was going to happen again on January 5th was when it was going to reboot. So this Sunday, and it was going to be $9 instead of the original $15. Now, if you talk to Paul Krugman, he believes it should be $80 based on the cost of traffic congestion in the city and what it costs for Manhattan as it relates to congestion. I think that might be a little extreme, but yeah, he wanted it to be even higher. So $9 seems pretty reasonable. But yeah, the political backlash has been great, and this was expected. Congestion taxes are not something that a lot of people support until they're implemented. This happened in Sweden, specifically Stockholm in 2003 when they did congestion pricing. It had 2/3 of the citizens had disapproved it, and now 2/3 of the people have voted to keep it. So it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, of course no one's going to be excited to pay extra taxes. Like, why would you be, right?
Right.
And I understand the political issues around that, and especially, the equity issues that people have, and I understand.
Right. But it's not.
The way they do.
But it's also, as you say, like now we're seeing the reactions on social media from some people that have to work like in the city. I saw the New York Times did a ride along with a taxi driver who said, I was skeptical, but now I can get from point A to point B in a much quicker fashion. If you could just speak about the immediate effects of this congestion pricing and how it helps emergency response time. So like people aren't dying in an ambulance. And overall, traffic has reduced drastically just in the first few days of its implementation. Yeah,
completely drastically. So we've seen response times for emergency vehicles in 2024, almost 9 to 10 minutes for ambulances in Manhattan. And that is directly related to congestion. People will tell you it's bike lanes, and that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. But yeah, so we've seen pretty large gaps with respect to response times. And then conversely, we've also seen, I don't know if you remember Gridlock Sam Schwartz, who used to be the head of the New York City DOT in the 70s and 80s. He said that based on his tracking since the early 70s, that in 2024, traffic was the worst Manhattan had ever seen. And so this was the only way to kind of disincentivize people. And some of the pro-congestion advocates have said, pro-congestion pricing advocates had said, even if we burned that money, like even if we burned all the money we got, the actual health outcomes of letting people in Manhattan breathe better are actually worth it, less so the goal of, funding the MTA. And so, yeah, we don't have a lot of data yet, right? Because it just started on Sunday. So it is a little hard to be like, well, maybe it was quieter in January. It was snowing on Sunday. Like there are certain like statistical things, right? But since then, peak hour traffic, the commute times for all of the tunnels and bridges have gone down about half of the time. So I think it was the Battery Park Tunnel usually sees about 16 minutes of time to get through the tunnel. It's about down to 7 or 8 minutes. And so it's definitely working. I don't know if you saw, there was a really funny TikTok of this guy who was like, in his very heavy New York accent, like, the MTA is taxing us like crazy. Let's see what it does. And it took him 3 minutes to get through Canal Street from one end to the other. And he goes, okay, I F with it.
Yeah.
So it is one of those things where people have to see it. And I mean, the results, at least anecdotally via TikTok videos, are stark. It's just one of those things of like the political fallout of people just still not wanting to pay. Everyone knew that congestion pricing would work. That was never the problem. It was more of like the political appetite for charging people, especially in like areas of like Staten Island, Eastern Queens, that rightly feel like transit is not good enough for them to just ditch their car, right? I think that's a fair thing. And I do think a lot of times advocates, especially transit advocates, we need to think that like people just don't drive cars because they hate transit. A lot of times it's like, I'm making a market decision every time I walk out of my house, what's easier to get to, right?
Right.
And if you're going from like Queens to Brooklyn, it's probably easier to drive, right? Like it is, because there's very few subway systems that way. If you're going to like Carnegie Hall, it probably is easier for you to take the train, right? Because there's no parking. So you're always thinking of these like market decisions. And I do think sometimes advocates, we fail to just be like, well, take the train. It's like, well, it's not, it doesn't work for everyone, right? And I think that's a chicken or the egg situation with, we need money to expand transit. And so that's kind of where we're at. And I don't feel too bad for people in Nassau County, to be honest with you.
Right. And the point is that like, this is not replicable in most 99% of the country, like in terms of geographic location, right? Like the New York City, as you say, this was why it was such a no-brainer, is because of in the affected area in Manhattan, where and this is a part of the income inequality of the city as well. There is endless. So all of the subway lines converge there. It makes it as easy as possible to go from almost any part of Manhattan, except for like Stuyvesant Town or other areas that are poorer, and this is by design. You can use public transit incredibly easy, but in areas like Queens, right, there are fewer subway lines because those are poorer areas. You may have to use the bus. Buses are going to be to benefit from this congestion pricing as well. But like the point is that this tax is there to fund improvements in the subway rail lines. Something like a majority of our subway stops are not handicapped accessible, for example. Like this is the kind of, if you could just explain what this money is going to go towards and how it'll hopefully benefit people who may be forced to use a car and they can use public transportation in the coming years as well.
Yeah, well, I think like when it talks about people who would drive and never take transit, it doesn't matter how much money you charge them. I think the argument I would make is like, isn't $9 worth not seeing brake lights in front of you your entire commute, right? Like just the piece of not having to see brake lights in front of your thing should be a reason you A, support transit in general, and B, you pay the congestion price because it doesn't matter. Like I'm getting into the city much quicker than I would before. I think I want to stress this, and this is something that I think I've changed my worldview a little bit since the election, is we are in an age where, I mean, look at what the LA fires, where people don't trust institutions. And this is a bipartisan thing, right? Like Democrats don't trust, I mean, like literally my health insurance doesn't cover my inhaler. I found that out this morning. I was really mad, right? Like I'm pissed at all the healthcare system in this country, and so are Republicans. And I'm annoyed that we haven't expanded subways, and Republicans are mad that like the transit is not, efficient enough. So I think there's like bipartisan issues with our institutions, and I do think the MTA and a lot of our New York City institutions, and really everywhere, our big city institutions have failed people, and so a lot of this is more about trust. Like $68.4 billion would build about 177 miles of subway system in Spain. And a lot of people aren't going to see, with $68 billion, are not going to see a massive market improvement in their own subway stop. I can't promise that. And I think that's a big problem, is like we need to reform a lot of these agencies while also funding them. And that is a hard
sell.
That's a hard sell, right? Because like Trump, rightly so, and I'm obviously not a Trump fan, but like Trump rightly so will be like, the MTA is taking too much money, like to do what they want to do. And I'm like, I agree, but also they should get the money because Republicans aren't and Democrats aren't going to fix the actual issues to make the MTA run better.
That's right-wing politics, right? They
Correct.
defund our institutions, and then when they don't work, they use that for further for further defunding. The point is like that is that is why this is a good news, is because despite those political headwinds, despite the fact that this is about reinforcing an institution that people have a ton of problems with, it is still a win to improve that and not imposing austerity, which is usually what the solution that is floated by members of both parties.
Correct. And I think that's like where we're now at, is like, and I wrote this in my Substack, my first Substack article, is like Republicans and like these tech bros and whatnot, they're at the door, at the gates, and they're like trying to knock down all of our institutions. And Democrats, at least in this election, were like trying to hold the gates back to be like, no, don't touch, the DOE, or don't touch these things that we know are not working, but we don't want you to like destroy or abolish them. We want to reform them. And so I think that's kind of like this healthy tension we've had, where it's like people are like, well, I'm paying money for the MTA and I don't see any changes, and I've not seen any changes. You're just taking my money, right? And like, that's a fair argument. It's kind of one of those things, like the MTA needs to gain the trust of people back by implementing reforms that come from the federal level and the state level and the local level to work more efficiently. And that's not something that I recognize. And so I think that's kind of this healthy back and forth that a lot of people with congestion pricing are having, is that even if you convince them, like, we have 25% of the New York City subway is ADA accessible. And the ADA law was passed under H.W. Bush in 1990. So that means that it's been 35 years where like all of these subway stops have not had elevators, and they are very hard to put in because you're putting them into stations that have been around since the 1920s. So you're like trying to like invasively put these elevator and escalators into very old pre-war subway stops, and so it's not cheap. And so with this money, we'll be seeing tons of signal upgrades. You'll see about 60, I believe it's 60 new subway stations will get escalators and elevators. 1,500, I don't know if anyone's who's in New York City has ridden the new subway trains, the new subway cars. We're trying to order 1,500 more of those. And then more regional rail upgrades with Metro North, and new cars at Metro North, and new cars at the Long Island Railroad. And for those who are annoyed from New Jersey, $100 million of those dollars are going to New Jersey for New Jersey Transit as part of the lawsuit, because New Jersey keeps suing New York over it.
Can you explain that? Can you explain?
I'd love
because
to.
they're trying. What New Jersey's doing, in contrast, is adding another lane to the freeways, because
they don't need to anymore now.
When I think about my home state, I just think I wish there were more freeways. I wish there were more highways in the Garden State, specifically in North Jersey. Yeah,
one more lane, bro.
Yeah.
So I mean, what's his name? Phil Murphy is trying to expand the Garden State Turnpike through like Bayonne and Jersey City, against Jersey City's wishes. I'll have you like, no.
Yeah.
To the tune of $10 billion to add another
Jersey City
lane.
has a beautiful rail system. Beautiful rail system. Yeah.
Wonderful mayor, Stephen
Yep.
Fulop. We need him for New Jersey. He won't probably win, unfortunately, due to the machine. But he is absolutely excellent on housing and transit and livable communities. So that's kind of the issue, is that New Jersey residents and New Jersey taxpayers are and leaders are rightly annoyed that like they are going to be, extra tax, and that tax or that pricing would not help better their own transit system, which to me is like their fault. And they're like, I don't understand how Phil Murphy can get on TV or wherever and say, the transit is not good enough into New York City for people to just get out of their cars. And I think that's an issue on your part and your own leadership. So if that's an issue, that should be something that you fix. And under Phil Murphy's leadership and under Josh Gottheimer's whatever
potential leadership.
Yeah, I mean, there's been about a 5% decrease in bus service and transit service since 2019 in the state, and they've let the state's transit system basically rot. There's also been 15% fare hikes as of last year, and this is my favorite part. They've also said that there will be 3% increases in fares going forward every year, just year over year. And so when Josh Gottheimer is talking about how driving a car from like wealthy parts of northern New Jersey, where he's like represents, and going into New York City is a tax on the working class, I guess my question to him would be, what is a tax on the working class? But a majority of your congressional district actually takes transit into the city, and every year for the foreseeable future, they will have to pay 3% increase, which could be more than inflation for the foreseeable future. And that's not something that you bring up or talk about. So I think that's a massive issue. And I think it comes back to this argument that I've had forever, where like in America, we don't treat transit as an actual way of moving people from A to B. We think of it as a social welfare program. And because of that, it's just kind of like, oh, well, if you don't have a car, we'll have this bus for you that comes every hour. And we've like checked off the box versus like actually using transit to like move people from A to B.
Right. And then it's a part of hopefully our greener future as well, when we can on another day maybe explore that angle. But Hayden Clarkin, I always love our conversations, even
Thanks so much for having me.
It's a little self-serving just because this is where I grew up. But I do think, and this congestion pricing thing, you mentioned Stockholm, London, right? Also implemented it. This
Milan,
this is the kind of, I think globally, hopefully there's some more focus on congestion pricing as well. Really appreciate your time today. Check out the Transit Guide on social media, but specifically on Substack now that you've launched that. Thanks so much, Hayden.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. Have a good one.
Of course. Yeah, you too.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.